seat here?
Yes.
How's volleyball?
Long.
Long? Your season starts soon, right?
Tomorrow the first game.
She
Tomorrow?
worked all day too, so.
Huh?
She worked all day and then went to practice.
Oh, worked at the bagel place? So, yeah, I'll be planning on coming again. I enjoyed last year. And I got a football schedule. Since the football coach is now coming to church here, I love to go. So, in fact, like I said, for years and years, I did the public address at the high school there in Indianapolis for football and basketball and baseball, and loved doing that. Yeah, we'll root on the Coral Shores High School. We're looking tonight at 1st and 2nd Peter in our New Testament study. Believe it or not, we're at session 18, which gives me just a moment to say, be thinking about what we might want to do next. We had done a couple of verse-by-verse studies. We looked at the book of Acts for a number of months. Then we looked at the book of Romans for a number of months. We decided to do this New Testament survey to kind of understand the world into which Jesus was born, the world into which the church was birthed, and then look at these individual books, sometimes looking at a couple a week, and try to get a feel for them. We still have a little bit of territory to cover after tonight. We look at 1st and 2nd Peter. Then, of course, we'll look at 1st John. We'll look probably at 2nd and 3rd John one night together, very short letters. Then we'll look at Jude, which is short, but is an interesting book. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about Revelation, which I know confounds a lot of people. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. Anybody who says that, don't trust. But I did teach at a Bible college for a while on the subject of Revelation and the second coming. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's not a long time, just another 4 or 5 weeks. And so be thinking about where do we want to go. And if you have suggestions, let me know. We'll probably go back into a Bible book. And there may be something that you're thinking about that you'd love for us to do. So please let me know. But tonight, we're going to try to look at these two letters together because they're written by the same author, likely in close proximity, one right after the other. These letters were written, as best we know, to Gentile Christians, although they would have certainly been something that would have been worthwhile for Jewish believers as well. But let me just tell you why I believe that. 1 Peter 4 and verse 3 says this: "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do." So that's language always in the New Testament talking about Gentiles. Okay? You've done what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. And so that, along with some other things in these letters, seems to indicate that they were written to Gentiles. But with that in mind, let's open up the pages of 1 Peter, and I'll give you a little background. Shockingly, there are some Bible scholars who think Paul authored these letters. Not only were they written to Gentiles, and Paul, by the way, was the apostle to the Gentiles, but much of the language, especially in 1 Peter, is similar to words and phrases used by Paul in his epistles. That phrase that I just read from 1 Peter 4:3 sounds very much like some Pauline language, where he would talk about a list of sins, and he would say, that's what you used to be before you came to Christ. So there are people who think that Paul wrote this, and you'll find some arguments for that. I find it kind of preposterous, to be honest with you. I take things at face value, and I believe that when somebody tells us that they're the author, especially when it's an apostle, unless there's compelling reasons to believe otherwise, why would we do that? We'll talk about authorship in a minute, but I just wanted you to know that in case you're studying this sometime and hear that thrown out. The main body of this letter resembles a sermon more than a letter. I don't know if you remember, you probably don't, but back last winter, I preached a series here from the book of 1 Peter. We spent about 10 weeks in that book before I started having us preach every week from the lectionary, one of the 4 readings. but I did a series from that, and it does lend itself to preaching because it sounds like a sermon, a very long sermon, so Daryl wouldn't be happy. He doesn't like long sermons, right, Daryl? So anyway, anyway, it's got some great material in it. And number 3 there, it's obvious that this letter is being written, or that as this letter is being written, there is much persecution and suffering among believers. So there's persecution of believers, there's suffering among believers. We're going to see that throughout the book of 1 Peter. Well, we've talked about the author for just a minute. Let's go to 1 Peter 1. And if somebody would read that first phrase, just the first part of verse 1.
To God's elect, exiles scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
Now you gave us the second phrase. Don't you have a phrase above that?
Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ.
Look a little closer.
See?
I messed you up.
Yes, you did. Peter.
There we go. Thanks, Doc. But you took care of the whole first verse, which is great, because we're going to get to the second part in a minute. So, Peter identifies himself, and we know Peter well, right? I mean, from the Gospels and from the book of Acts. Remember, the first 12 chapters of Acts follows Peter. And obviously, we see him throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's interesting because these letters help us see that real transformation has come into Peter's life. Remember, Peter was the one who made the good confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And his name, of course, he was changed from Simon to Peter, Petros, rock, right? So, Jesus intended for him to become a rock, but that wasn't the Peter that we often saw in the Gospels. In fact, right after Peter gave the good confession in Matthew 16, listen to what happened. Matthew 16:23. Jesus said in the 21st verse, I've got to go up to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die, right? And then on the third day be raised. I'm going to suffer and die did not jive with what Peter thought. He wanted an earthly Messiah, and he was upset about it, and so he said, "Never, Lord, that will never happen." And what did Jesus say? Matthew 16:23. "Get thee behind me, Satan." That's powerful words. You're a stumbling block. You don't have in mind the things of God. So there was that rebuke of Peter right after he had made the good confession. And then we know that Peter's the one who denied Jesus 3 times as he was being tried before he was crucified. But that Peter is now, here's the word for your outline, the rock that Jesus prophesied he would be. He has become that. And by the time he's writing, it's been 30 years, a little more than 30 since the church began. Of course, Peter's the one who preached the first gospel message, Acts chapter 2. And his spiritual growth has continued. And I think it's pretty neat because there were a couple of things that Jesus specifically prophesied that Peter would do. As he spoke into Peter's life, a couple of things he said that would happen. And I'll get you to help me. Somebody look up Luke 22:32.
Got it.
Okay, Abby's going to get that one. And somebody get John 21:17. John 21:17. Got a paper on that one?
I'll take it.
You're going to get that one, John? So, Abby, if you've got that first one, Luke 22:32.
But I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, strengthen your brothers.
Aha, listen to what he was supposed to do. Strengthen his brethren, the brothers and sisters in Christ. So that's the first thing. He demonstrates now through his life that he is fulfilling that. Even this book, both these letters, are strengthening the brethren. The other thing that he was specifically told was there at the lake when Jesus served them breakfast. Remember, after 7 of the disciples had been out fishing and and all, and Jesus had a coal fire, and John's going to read that one for us, John 21:17.
The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Do you love me? He said. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep.
Yeah, so he was to feed the Lord's sheep. 3 times he denied. 3 times Jesus asked him, do you love me? And he said yes, and he said, feed my sheep. So, that's exactly what Peter has done with his life. Strengthen the brethren, he's fed the sheep, and he's doing that as he writes these letters. Now, Doc already read for us that second part of verse 1 where we see the recipients. And by the way, you did a good job of pronouncing all of those places there, Daryl, including Cappadocia and Bithynia, all these places that were in Asia Minor. So this first epistle especially was sent to the churches in Asia Minor, what we today know as Turkey. On the west side of Turkey were incredible strong churches. Ephesus, of course, one of the leading cities there, but a lot of powerful churches. And apparently, these churches are going to receive the letter, and so it's going to circulate. Remember, most of the churches were house churches. They weren't big. They met in homes, and this would have been circulated. It might have taken quite a while to get to all those churches. What's interesting is, Paul had been in Asia Minor, and he had started some churches there, but most of these places that are being mentioned here are places Paul had not been. Places that, as best we know, the churches were started not by Paul, not by Peter, not by an apostle, probably by people who had been in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and then when there was a scattering after Stephen was stoned, and they made wherever they could get to safety, some of them back to their original homes. There would have been people that went into Asia Minor and brought the gospel, and churches were started. And although those churches were probably, most of them, started by Jewish Christians, they were mostly filled with Gentile people because they were in the Gentile world. So they were Gentile churches, and that's who Peter is writing this letter to. As far as date of writing, I know that doesn't matter to most of us, but the date is related to authorship because we know that Peter died in Rome. The Bible doesn't tell us, but history does. And historical tradition is that he was crucified upside down at his request because he wasn't worthy of dying the same way as Christ his Lord. We know it was under the emperorship of Nero. Nero was the emperor, and we think that Peter's death was sometime between 65 and 67 AD. We're pretty sure on that. And so if this is written before that, it's probably right before that. So if I was going to give a date, I would say 64 AD. Not long before Peter is going to be killed. And Peter and Paul both will be executed by Nero at a similar point in time. What about the message? This is what's really important. And man, this has got some good stuff. This first epistle concentrates on the theme of trials or suffering and attempts to get the believers to attain victory over testing by seeing what the ultimate purpose of God is. So a lot here about trials and suffering and persecution. And in that day and age, under Nero, Christians were under siege. This was after Nero had burned the city of Rome and had really turned against Christians. And there was some serious suffering going on. And Peter's going to say suffering is not something to be ashamed of. Some Christians were saying, if you're suffering, something's wrong with you. Because if you're a Christian, life's supposed to be easy, right? No. In fact, he's going to use the illustration of gold that goes through the fire and that comes out on the other side pure. The dross is burned off, right, by the fire. And so what happens is when we go through difficult times, they can be used by God to help us become stronger in our faith. And we are told that sometimes believers will suffer for doing good, right? Sometimes believers will suffer for doing good, but we are to emulate the example of Christ in such times. Peter makes that very, very clear. In fact, we'll look at a verse in a minute. That's, I think, one of the key verses that makes that abundantly clear. That Jesus suffered, so why should we expect anything less? And I think it was Martin Luther that said, if Jesus bore a crown of thorns, why would we expect a life of roses, of rose petals? We're going to have some thorns too. We're not going to just have roses, is what he was saying. That, there's going to be some thorns along the way as we live for Christ. We don't look for persecution. We don't try to bring it on, but it happens. Now, number 2 there, a large part of this first letter deals with the necessity of living in holiness. Key to this book is understanding that we are to be holy even as God is holy. And we're called to be set apart. That's what holiness is. To be holy is to be set apart. We talked about sanctification last week, remember? We said that to be sanctified is to be in a process where we are becoming more and more like Christ and we're being set apart from the world. So Peter is a relevant message because it talks about Christian living in a pagan world. The more pagan the world is, the harder it is to live for Christ. And if you've been alive long enough, some of us that are, at 6, 7 decades and plus, I think we would say probably in the United States that things haven't gone real great in that direction. Don't get me wrong, there's always been plenty of sin, and there's sin everywhere in the world. There's good and bad everywhere. But we certainly do not live in a world right now that is for the most part glorifying God. So how do we live in a practical fashion? How do we live Christian lives in the midst of a pagan world? We don't just hole up and feel sorry for ourselves. No, we're set apart. We're called to be different than the world, but at the same time have a positive, I believe, outlook and a winsome personality that draws people to the Christian life. So we don't go around all the time being, so downcast and, it's so hard to live the Christian life and it's awful. And no, we have joy, but we also realize we're called to be holy. So we interact with the world, but we don't become like the world. That's hard. But it's what Peter deals with. That's why it's such a great book. So, how about the key word? I don't think this one's hard. Some books it's a little harder than others. The key word here is suffering, because that word appears, either suffer or suffering, appears 21 times in this first epistle. So you can't really miss it. But tied to suffering is hope. So if there's a secondary key word, it would be hope, because that's what we have as Christians, even though we're going to face difficulty in this life. And let me give you a couple of key verses. The first one is 1 Peter 4:1. I alluded to that a minute ago when I talked about how we're to emulate Christ. So if somebody would read 1 Peter 4, verse 1.
Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin.
Now we have to be careful with that verse, because there are a few people who grab onto it and talk about perfectionism and that we can become perfect in this life. Only way we're made perfect is through Christ. We're going to be presented perfect on the day of judgment, but we are still sinners in this life. However, we're done with sin when we come to Christ, in the sense that we won't answer for it. That's what justification is, right?